My name is Eric Flores Garcia. I'm an assistant professor at KTH in the Department of Production Engineering, and I will be hosting today's seminar for the Industrial Transformation Platform. I would also like for you to welcome you to this first seminar of the 2023 spring season for the Industrial Transformation Platform seminar series. Just a quick reminder of how is our process for this seminar series. We will have first the presentation of today's for about 30 minutes, after which we will open up the floor for any questions from the audience and have a discussion with our presenter. During the presentation, we will drop a link in the chat so that you can answer a survey that can help us improve our seminar series. And with that being said, then it is my great pleasure to introduce Sara Linderson, who is today's presenter for the Industrial Transformation Platform seminar series. Sara is an industrial PhD student at AstraZeneca, Sweden Operations in Södertälje. She has a master's degree in pharmacy from the University of Uppsala, which she obtained in 2013. She worked as a registered pharmacist before starting work at AstraZeneca. And she has been doing her PhD studies since 2018, focused on corporate lean management, particularly on level of standardization of methods and performance improvements. And with that being said, then Sara, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Eric. I will start by sharing my slides here. And thank you for the introduction. I think I can skip some of the slides even, so that's always a good start. So thank you for inviting me today to present a little bit about my research field, a little bit of my thoughts, and I also look forward to the discussion part later, because I encourage you to ask any questions, as these are valuable for my process later on. So today I want to talk about X production systems and discuss whether these can be enablers for sustainable transformation. And you have heard a little bit of my background as a pharmacist, so we don't have to deep dive in this. But last year I presented my licentiate thesis, which also means that I'm more in the later part of my doctoral program. Before we start in a more production context, I want us to zoom out, because we are all faced with the climate crisis right now. And it's quite rare that we have so clear targets as we have today. So we have quantified, we know the influence we have had for our climate. And we also know the irreversible effects we have when we push our planetary boundaries over certain limits. We also know how we as human beings have accelerated the carbon emissions the last century during the industrialization. So this is something we already know. We know what we need to do. The question now is, can we do it quickly enough? And many firms are definitely do their best to develop serious sustainability strategies. For instance, it's quite common to use science-based targets, which is a way to get an external validation of the targets for different carbon cutting programs, etc. To see that companies then align to the Paris Agreement and secure the speed we need to have right now. Another common framework are the UN's Sustainable Development Goals that are also quite well implemented in different strategies. And I particularly like this way to the right, how you can visualize that there's actually a prioritization between different dimensions in sustainability. So we cannot have a sustainable economy if the society is not sustainable. We can also not have sustainable societies if we don't have a sustainable biosphere. And I think we need to have this prioritization in mind. And these kind of frameworks are definitely influencing companies today. But if we narrow it down and when we come to a more functional strategy level, I'm interested in the production strategy and how well we can execute these strategies. If we want to assure the speed, we have to be very good in executing strategy. And there we also have several concepts and frameworks that are influencing the ways companies want to form the future operations. For instance, there's a lot of focus in different industrial revolutions where we have Industry 4.0 or smart factoring, which is very emphasized on the opportunities we have to implement technologies in production. We can have new technologies going towards more cyber physical systems, but it can also be old technologies that are more available because they're affordable and maybe we work more with implementation. But I'm also quite fond of the emerging concept of Industry 5.0. And I don't necessarily see 5.0 as continuing after Industry 4.0. But what I like with the Industry 5.0 is that it's also conceptualizing the values of transforming operations. And they work with, it's the European Commission that have developed this concept to address that the future operation needs to be human-centric, resilient, and sustainable. So it's quite natural that companies have new emerging production strategy. But here they don't start from scratch with a blank paper. Companies already have many years of experience how to transform business, transform operating models, working with different mechanisms to be efficient when executing a new production strategy. And this leads me to why I want to focus on XPS, which is very much based on learnings from previous and still current lean transformations companies are going through. So X production system, where the X stands for the company, is a phenomenon when companies realize that we cannot only copy what Toyota did, we cannot only take lean as Toyota did. We need to go from implementing isolated improvement projects from different management concepts to start moving and creating more lasting improvement programs so that companies can transform and improve operations over time, over a longer time span. And when the aims are not fully clear yet, but you're exploring more on a corporate level. And I'm sure that many of you have maybe seen these type of models before, which is a way to conceptualize the XPS and try to follow a little bit the Toyota production system. But these can obviously be adapted to the company's essence to more or less extent. So the purpose of developing an XPS is to create some kind of common reference point in the improvement work and create an umbrella, a common umbrella for how to make improvements. And it's about creating a common improvement language so that people can collaborate to a bigger extent. And also to create a learning system so that a new production strategy can be executed in an efficient way in many production sites if we talk about the corporate level. I included this picture for you to get a sense of this more evolving view when you create an XPS. First of all, I want you to note the time span here. So developing and creating an XPS is something that happens over a long time span. And this is a paper that I think illustrates this in a good way, that that an XPS is evolving based on the company's need and values, and also current theories in different time episodes. So you could see this as a corporate level experimentation, and then you can also guess that the implementation pattern will be more looping. So maybe you implement something and then you evaluate how did this go, and then you continue in that pattern. I also like Netland and Ferdo's S-curve theory, which you see here to the left. It's also setting more accurate expectations, what you can expect from implementing. This is the case of implementing lean. The example is from Volvo production system, and they explored how can you implement lean in different plants. And then they could see that the operational performance did not improve in a linear way. So this is nothing you can expect. In the beginning, you will have a more exploration phase and perhaps not improve the performance. But later you will have more rapid improvement as you mature. So here you can also see that if you have different maturity phases, you can also expect that you need to have different actions depending where you are during this maturity journey. So this is a model that I presented in my licentiate thesis, and this was an attempt to go a little bit beyond the more classical conceptual models with the houses that I showed the previous slide, to go a little bit beyond and deeper and see, but what are the similarities and differences between companies' way to implement their XPS? And here I came up to that there are 4 parameters that are very much dependent on each other. And these are different parameters that the companies work on when they try to execute and implement their XPS. I will not go so deep into this, but for you to get a feel what I mean with these parameters, we have the use of conceptual model as a very important ingredient. These are the very abstract models to somehow model that these are the principles that are used, and they are often fit for the company's essence and values. These can be more or less abstract. You can also have conceptual models for how the tools are interacting, how the leadership models are looking like, and etc. But these are very abstract, so it's not enough with that. But it's also common that companies develop their company-specific toolboxes. And here, you, as a company, you have an opportunity to choose them from different management concepts so that you make it to your own. So you can take classical lean methods or Six Sigma from TPM, etc., into your own toolbox. These can also be more or less extensive and available. And it's very common to create different method standards or developing a training portfolio as an asset then for implementation in different production sites. Which also leads me to the implementation structure. It's also common to develop an organization that will have the main responsibility to implement the XPS. For instance, different XPS offices that can be at a global, regional, or local level. And the different change agents or lean coordinators, they can have different roles in implementation. Sometimes they are the ones driving implementation. Sometimes it's expected that the leader should drive the implementation. So this can be different. It's common to develop some kind of roadmap to guide implementation, work with networks and different implementation projects to also implement the XPS. And if we now remember the more evolving view, how an XPS is created, it's also reasonable to think that companies need to apply different control practices to evaluate how's the progress of a program, but also on the performance development. So it's quite common to integrate these practices with the overall performance management. For instance, measuring correlation between how maturity is evolving and performance is improving. And it's also common to develop assessment frameworks to also add some pressure for implementation, benchmarking externally, internally, but also reporting to stakeholders in different formal meetings. So these together will then constitute the company's deployment strategy. So let's look a little bit more at other publications. If we look to the left here, there are others that have reported to the tendency to start with a heavy tools focus when you implement lean. And then you can also not expect a sustainable improvement pattern. And maybe you need to change your way of implementing so that you get more the systems-based change. And lately, there has been more and more focus on the more softer aspects of lean when it comes to mindset, culture, leadership, learning part of lean, etc. And this is something that we can also see from a corporate level, that maybe in the beginning, the deployment strategy will be more a wave-like implementation of tools, maybe pushing out tools for the production sites to implement, where there also can be a shift then in the approach when you realize, okay, we need to go for a more principle-based approach. Which then leads me to the right side of the slide, where this publication explores how to roll out an XPS from a knowledge perspective. So here the investigation is how can you roll out an XPS so that the knowledge diffusion will be effective and efficient. And they chose to look at 3 different dimensions. So one of them was the degree of centralization. They could see that either you could have more plant management driven implementation, or where the headquarters would decide this is what you should implement. And when it comes to knowledge replication strategy, it's about the degree of codification when rolling out the XPS. Should it be less codified, then it would be more principle-driven approach. But if it's more codified, it's more template-based approach. The third dimension, it's a bit complex word, type of ambidexterity, but this is about what I mentioned before in the implementation structure. You can have dedicated roles to implement lean, for instance, or you can have more fuzzy lines between the organization and the lean coordinator roles. And so when you have more fuzzy boundaries and you have more common responsibility to implement, it's more contextual type. Whereas when you have very clear boundaries, it's a structural type. And they present that the most effective way to roll out an XPS is when you have a plant management driven, principle driven, and contextual rollout from a knowledge perspective. And I think this is very interesting when we talk specifically about corporate lean management. We will also have the specific aspect of coordinating and managing knowledge between multiple production sites. So this leads me to talk more about knowledge transfer and different mechanisms into that. And this is a very simplified picture, but I still wanted to have it just to stimulate you to ask questions later in the discussion. So if we acknowledge that we have 2 types of knowledge, which I tried to have the symbol, the book and the people. If the book stands for the more explicit knowledge, this is the type of knowledge that can be quite easy to formulate with numbers or words. So you could write a book, or you can make templates, or you could make an e-learning. But the more tacit knowledge, it's knowledge or only embedded in people. And an example is that you could read how many books you want about riding a bike, but it's not until you ride a bike you start possessing that knowledge and skill. And likewise, you can use different mechanisms then if you want to transfer these different types of knowledge. So one hand, you can use standards to transfer knowledge, but at some points you have to have more social interaction to transfer knowledge, which could then be frequent dialogues. Shadowing is quite popular in a lean context, coaching, and etc. Why I have this picture is because what I have seen is something quite interesting, that the people that have gained most value from a social interaction mechanism, maybe learned from dialogues and coaching, etc., still have the tendency to want to scale up that learning by developing standards. So somehow this process is not intuitive. We learn in one way, but we want to learn others with a total different mechanism. I think this is worth to deep dive a little bit in. Because this comes then to the complexity when you want to manage and coordinate a transformation with multiple production sites, that you will always want to strive for a global conformity. I mentioned that before. You want to have a common reference point, one improvement umbrella, the same language. You also need to have a certain global conformity. But one of the big issues for companies working with a global XPS is to decide what level of standardization should we have and on what. And maybe you think, oh, what's going on? These pictures are not super production oriented, but I was still thinking that let's look at these examples to stimulate some questions for the discussion. If we look at the template-based approach, I want to illustrate this as a paint by numbers sheet. So what can you expect from this? First of all, you will have very low variation in the end result. You will have the same picture every time. You could also imagine that it doesn't take so much time for you to start doing the task. However, you can also imagine how fun is it to always paint this way. Maybe it's not super stimulating after a while. If we then move to a more principle-based approach, it could rather look like this, that you get the instruction that please paint me a picture with a tree full of birds. This will obviously take more time. Maybe you need to know how to paint the tree, the bird. Maybe you want to explore how the colors are blending. But while you master this, if you start master this, you can paint whatever picture you want, and you will have a deeper type of knowledge. And here you see, okay, it's not the question whether we should have a template-based approach or principle-based approach. You obviously need to have both. The question is, where should you standardize and where should you allow variation? And this is also something that we can see in different corporate lean assessments, that there are many benefits, but also several issues with that. The benefits you want to have is to check progress and create some kind of motivation to start implementing. You provide a roadmap and guidance, and you also communicate that this is important. You give opportunities for learning and collect and celebrate success stories. And one important part is then that you assimilate the lean implementation between different sites so that you don't have completely different approaches going from the reference point. But the negative part is that these assessments will always cost, and you will always add some type of bureaucracy, which can sometimes be counteracting for decentralizing knowledge, which is often the main goal with an XPS or executing new production strategy. There's also a risk that you get too focused on compliance so that you lose relevance. And you also risk to have a bias that some parts will be easy to assess. For instance, do you have this template or tool in place? Whereas mindset, leadership, these things are very difficult to assess, even though you can feel when someone is very good at something. And you can, in worst case, you can reduce local ownership, and you can demotivate production sites, which will also be a bad condition for innovation. So this is important to bring with you. I just want to show a little bit. This is from my own case study where I explored the global implementation of an assessment framework that aimed to improve lean capabilities. So the purpose was to move beyond tools and focus more on behaviors, and also implement other transfer mechanisms. So going beyond classroom training to having more the knowledgeable person meeting the ones being trained. What was interesting with this case was, despite that this was a very standardized assessment framework, you could still see several differences when it came to the implementation in different regions. I will not deep dive in this, but it's more, what I could see was that the implementation was very context driven, and I could find 5 central parameters in the implementation in order to try to compare these approaches. And some of the issues with these approaches was tick in the box behavior when lean implementation became an own value in itself, which is directly productive to the whole purpose of the assessment framework. For you only to get a sense of my own research. To summarize a bit, so how is the XPS enabling a sustainable transformation? I can see some opportunities and risks. For instance, if you have invested a lot in what I call structure capital, you can use these very abstract models. You can use the frameworks you use for different implementation structure or toolbox. You can also use the training programs you already have in place, because if you have invested already in these assets, they could also be beneficial for new production strategy. And you should also use the change agent's experience, because what I call implementation excellence is a specific set of skills so that you don't make the same mistakes with new strategy. For instance, having extensive tool focus, decoupling from performance, or not, or too much focus on assessments, for instance. An opportunity is when you create an XPS and you create a system for learning as well. So you have a philosophy for your improvement work, and this improvement-driven learning can be beneficial for new concepts. I'm thinking about circular economy, etc. It can help you understand new concepts. But the risk could be if you don't see the XPS as an investment in these different aspects. Maybe you develop a parallel sustainability organization or smart factory organization. Maybe you also lose the basics and not considering that there are different maturity levels within your firm, or that certain control practices, maybe they're efficient to get something out, but it can also reduce innovation within the firm, which you definitely need for transformation. Or that you maybe fail to see XPS as a lasting program. Maybe you start developing a parallel program and not seeing that the XPS is a mechanism to execute new production strategy as well. So I did summarize some of the papers I think package this research area in quite a good way, if you're interested to read more. Otherwise, I look forward to questions. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Sara. Thank you for a really nice presentation. So now I open up the session for any questions from our audience. So if you have a question, just please open up your mic, or you can also type your question into the chat.
I can ask a question, Sara. What do you think is the role of new technologies and new digital technologies in the implementation process?
This is a good question. I do think that I guess I think about the pitfalls at first. So the risk is that that we start using technology in some kind of gaps where we perhaps just need to do the basic learning of, for instance, if maybe we had an assessment approach in the firm, and then we think, oh, it's failing, and that's because it's slow. We need to digitalize something, but you still you keep the assessment approach to implement something. So maybe you don't find the root cause of why the implementation is failing in the first place. That was my first thought right now. And I do think that there are many opportunities when it comes to some kind of learning excellence for the parts where it's not tacit knowledge you need to implement.
Yeah.
I think that you can be very efficient in making pretty standards and making things look very good. But then the risk again is that you try to do it even when you want to transfer tacit knowledge. So
yeah,
it's a good question. I'm not saying I have a clear answer on that.
I like your answer. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions?
I have a question. First of all, thank you for a very nice and comprehensive lecture for me about the XPS. I was very interested in this topic. And one of my question is, I feel like this XPS concept, you are very human oriented. It's all about the human involved in this kind of organization. But for example, some industries, maybe they are very high, they have higher automation level. Maybe they don't have human anymore. And maybe in the future, we don't need that much human in the companies or manufacturing companies. And do you think, do we still need lean concept for the future, like without human, or the human is always involved in this lean concept or lean manufacturing?
It's a good question. Thank you. I think that it will remain important because we will always have some type of improvement work. So I've never seen a project that has been perfect from the beginning, even though it's very human oriented, or if you need to program a software or having a robot, you will always have some sort of improvement work. And if you have improvement work, you will always have decision making, which is somehow designed by people. But I do think that if you have new technology, you can be much further away from where the value happens. We call it Gemba. It can also be a risk that we think that we lose the power of decision making and improvement work, which I don't believe in. I think we're going to keep on improve, even though we have less humans at the shop floor. Did that answer your question?
Yes. Thank you so much.
I have another question that fits quite well. You talked a lot about improvement and lean, talking a lot about improvement methods. What do you think, is it suitable to shift to sustainability or to just a sustainable factory or a sustainable society through improvements? Or do you think that lean or also improvement thinking is not facilitating redesigning systems, and therefore maybe with just thinking of improvements, we cannot make the shift to sustainable systems and have the risk of sub-optimization maybe? What do you think about that?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's also quite interesting. And I think this is also how you view the learning process, innovation process. And there's also an assumption that when we talk about in a lean context, it's quite common to talk about continuous improvements and therefore incremental improvements, so that we probably are not able to disrupt and change these radical improvements so that we can do step changes. And I don't know if I really believe in that working with an XPS would only solve the more incremental or find the more incremental solutions, because then I want to address more the learning perspective of an XPS. When you develop a system for learning, when you need to analyze issues, and when you need to experiment, this is what we need to do. The learning goes hand in hand in what type of improvements you will find. But this doesn't mean, of course, you want to improve existing models, and then you want to maybe find future models. So maybe you have different persons working with different tasks, but it doesn't mean that the XPS is irrelevant for the different roles.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Great. I actually have a question myself that perhaps relates to the two previous ones. And I was thinking, you shared with us this very nice conceptual model in the lean, in the XPS perspective. And I was reflecting on, do you see any change of the on these 4 or 5 aspects that you've identified compared to traditional manufacturing, as opposed to now that we're aiming towards more of an industrial transformation? How do you see? Is there like is there a difference from if we're orienting ourselves towards sustainable manufacturing?
So if I understood your question correctly, is it some approaches in implementation that if I can see trends in that, this is the movement? Yeah, I think it is a good question. So what we have seen is that if we think about the model with the conceptual model, the toolbox, implementation structure, and control practices, I do think that the easiest part is to start with the conceptual model. It's quite often that this is something you want to change. And I would claim, because you're not aware of all the other elements part of an implementation. But when you realize, oh, our model is abstract enough, maybe we don't have to change it, then you want to move towards a more toolbox improvement. So maybe you have, for example, AstraZeneca, we have implemented lean tools with a focus on the green aspects. For example, Green Kaizen, that comes from a collaboration with KTH or environmental VSM. So you can see that you have a more integration on a tool basis. However, when it comes to the implementation structure, I think many maybe fall in the pitfall when you start developing other parallel organizations. And maybe this is an indication that you don't really see what the XPS can be used for. But when it comes to, I talk a lot about the principle-based approach, template-based approach. It seems to be more like a pendulum situation. So if you had a very template-based approach, you realize this is not working. We want to have a more principle-based approach. But if you had principle-based approach for a long time, you have so great variation. And maybe in transformation, you want to mobilize, you want things to go quickly. Maybe you want to centralize a little bit more. So I see it more as a shifting, approach. So pendulum approach, perhaps.
Great, thank you. We have time is upon us, but we have time for one last question from the audience.
Maybe I can ask a question, if that's okay. And perhaps this question is a little bit connected to what Eric asked and your reflection, because you mentioned that XPS could be a way for companies to understand new concepts and maybe try to roll out new strategies. And then you also mentioned at the beginning a little bit about this new approach with Industry 5.0. So I wonder if you have any reflections about how can companies think about this? I mean, is this something new? Is it also going to create like a new, as you mentioned now, like a parallel organization working with Industry 5.0, or how to leverage, for example, on the XPS, as you were mentioning? Maybe just your thoughts or reflections about that.
Yeah, so this will be definitely my own thoughts on this, but I do see that from my point of view, Industry 4.0 has been very oriented on the technical opportunities, but not perhaps putting it into a management system or with values and applications or purposes for why do you implement these technologies. So I don't see Industry 5.0 as something that's continuing, rather than maybe the discussion around Industry 4.0 has been too narrow-minded. Maybe it has been too focused on technology. So the emerging concept of 5.0 is maybe a response to that. We forgot to discuss some of the things when it comes to why should we implement technology. There will always be a purpose that will gain human beings. It will be creating value for someone. So I do think that I already, before I did this seminar, I was looking around a bit of what kind of illustrations do you have around the industrial revolutions? And then you can see already that, okay, you have 4.0. All of a sudden, when 5.0, then you have AI, the more human robot, and etc. And I would say that this is a misunderstanding of what the European Commission wanted when they came up with the 5.0 concept, because it's not about a technical revolution. It's rather than why do we want to implement the technology? It always has to have a purpose and value. And if you look at AI, that was already part of the 4.0 concept. So I don't know why that will be the natural evolvement. So I think that a lot of companies will have the misunderstanding that like the common response is 5.0, we're not even done with 4.0. So I would claim that if you put more emphasis on your XPS, you will see we have a mechanism how we decide to implement the new technologies, because we have the decision model, we have the guidelines for how improvements should work within the firm. It will guide you where to put your technology as well, so that you have the values and purposes you need according to your strategy. But this is highly like personal discussion or reflection.
Thank you. Thank you, Sara.
Thank you. Thank you, Sara, and thank you to all our participants for listening in to our first seminar of the Industrial Transformation Platform. We invite you to follow our next seminars in this series for the spring. And with these words, I will close today's session. Thank you, everyone, for participating, and have a good weekend.
Thank you.